Okay, so with the next two slides, this is a brief presentation. The next two slides, we are going to take a look at the politics of America's ever-changing demographics with very, sort of a targeted focus here on the shifting racial and ethnic demographics here in America and America's shifting age demographics. All right, and we'll see that indeed these demographic profiles are always changing. And in terms of how they're changing, there are tremendously powerful political implications to that. Right, these are some of our sort of political tectonic plates that fundamentally shape our politics. Let's start out talking about the demographics of race and ethnicity here in America and its impact on our politics. This is something that's always changing, so we can get snapshots. Just recognize that these are snapshots, and over time, that data does change. And we know that, right, from the 2020 census that just came out. The U.S., as best we can tell, is currently about 57% white, about 20% Latino, 13% Black, 6% Asian American, less than 1% Native American, and then I think, something like 4% or so are mixed race, which is actually the fastest growing category, but it's relatively small yet. And it turns out that a lot of these changes that we're seeing and that will continue on into the foreseeable future is related to a 1965 law on immigration under President Johnson. Right, we know the 60s were a time of an upwelling of democracy, with things like the Black Civil Rights Movement, the Chicano Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Rights Movement, and other movements like the LGBTQ movement. And we see the same sort of democratic refashioning of our immigration policy that lifted quotas on different parts of the world. Specifically, before 1965, as a result of laws from the early to mid-1920s, had greatly limited immigration from Asia and South America. So those were lifted, and we emphasized family reunification policies. And that meant a lot of immigration, it turns out, from Latin America and from Asia. So a tremendous influx, in short, of Latinos and Asian Americans that have really reshaped, right, our racial and ethnic demographics, and therefore continues to reshape our politics. All right, so we're not that far. Right? We're within sight of being no longer white majority, although whites will continue to be the single largest racial and ethnic group by far. Now that is not the case. Well, no, it is the case in Nevada that whites are now less than 50%. But still the single largest group, racial and ethnic group. Right, so, whites make up less than half of Nevada. Non-whites make up more than half. California was the first state to reach that, and I think others since have crossed the same line. States like New Mexico and I think Arizona and Texas, if memory serves. Did I say New Mexico? Anyway. And then, right from there, Las Vegas, the Las Vegas Valley, even less white, if you will. And I think, although sometimes it can be hard to get this data, I believe now Latinos are a larger percentage of the Las Vegas population than whites, just by a little bit. But still, right, at the very least, that's symbolic. I think whites make up somewhere around 29% of Las Vegas, and Latinos about 31%, something like that. And it can be hard to get that data. That's quite remarkable. And of course, Asian Americans are, they're a pretty big chunk of the valley here, maybe around 10% or so. Don't quote me on that. It might be a larger number. So as diverse as America is becoming, Nevada is more so, and Las Vegas even more so. And that's true in general, right, of the American Southwest. A lot more racially and ethnically diverse than much of the rest of the country. So, what does that mean for our politics? Well, truth be told, right, there's kind of a, if you will, a dark side, and that is that racial and ethnic diversity generates conflict. Right? We tend to organize at some level around our racial and ethnic identities, and that creates fault lines that can generate conflict. That's true in our country, it's true in other countries. Something seems endemic to the human condition with that. I don't know. That being said, our racial diversity can also be seen as a tremendous strength and something that we can draw upon to become a better, more interesting, and stronger country and state and so forth. Because diversity, right, brings a lot to the table. It's a resource in many ways. Something we should also note here, within each of these categories that we have delineated, right, there can be a lot of variation and diversity within diversity. You should always recognize that. You see that especially, I would say, in the Latino community, where you have, let's say, Cuban Americans centered mostly in Florida who tend to be politically conservative. Yeah, and they were critical, in fact, to Donald Trump's success in Florida in 2020. You have Mexican Americans in much of the American Southwest. They tend to be much more Democratic, much less Republican. You might also be talking about, right, Mexican Americans who've been here ever since the end of the Mexican-American War versus Mexican Americans who've just come across the border and may not be documented. So quite a range there as well. You got Puerto Ricans in the Northeast where I grew up, places like New York and Philadelphia. And they are, right, Puerto Ricans are native born. It's a territory of the U.S., so if you're born in Puerto Rico, you're born American. And if you want to move to Philadelphia or New York, you can do that without a passport. Without a passport, because it's part of America. Yeah. Same thing, right, for Asian Americans. It's always interesting that we call some of these Asian American communities, in our case, a community of shopping and retail, for the most part, Chinatowns. Because often they're made up of lots of different Asian American groups. I know there's a sign somewhere in Chinatown that says Koreatown, capturing sort of that issue of diversity within diversity. So, you know, you're talking about Japanese Americans in maybe California who've been there for generations. You're talking about Chinese Americans who've moved here recently. You're talking about those maybe from India or Indonesia or Vietnam or South Korea, right? Lots of different possibilities here. So we do use the term Asian American, but just recognize that sort of covers up a whole lot of different identities within that larger sort of a claim. All right, and the final thing I would note here is, right, as we do become less white, some think that spells the doom of the current Republican Party. I don't know about that. We'll see. The history of our political parties suggests a level of adaptability that you know, maybe the Republicans, to the extent that this is something they need to cope with, they can adapt. You know, they'll need to change some things, like some of their policies, quite honestly. But I wouldn't rule it out. We've seen it before. We'll see it again. So there's that to consider. Also true that Trump showed some strength, you know, minor strength, mostly regional, within certain subgroups within the Latino community. He won the Cuban American vote decisively in Miami. That's what led to his big victory in Florida. And he did surprisingly decently, I think maybe 50-50 among, maybe even better than that, among Mexican Americans in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, near the border with Mexico. That was surprising to many. Certainly it caught me by surprise. So it's not like he did great among Mexican Americans in Texas, but he did, you know, he outperformed the typical Republican candidate, despite some of his anti-immigrant rhetoric. So don't rule out the ability of the Republican Party to reach the Latino voter. They've had some limited success there, and they're, you know, certainly looking in that direction going forward. Oh, shoot, I had something else I wanted to say. So I would not count out the GOP just yet, just because America is becoming less white. Plus, right, the Latino community in particular hasn't always been thrilled with the Democratic Party. And what was President Obama's nickname? The deporter in chief, because he deported so many immigrants, often for minor traffic offenses. So the Democrats by no means are guaranteed the Latino vote. Now that being said, I believe Biden won the Latino vote by about 2-1. That's historically normal in the modern era. So let's not go crazy on the ability of Trump to win over Latinos. It's pretty limited, but it was a little surprising in some cases. Yeah. Okay. I think I will leave it there. Thanks. Next, I want to talk about America's shifting age demographics. Like just about every other Western Hemisphere nation these days, the U.S. is an aging country. People are living longer. Um, Birth rates are down a little bit. And so we are, in that sense, an aging population. A larger and larger percentage of us are age 65 and older. This shift towards an older population has put tremendous pressure on the programs in particular of Social Security and Medicare, two federal entitlement programs that are being affected substantially by an aging American demographic. Um, yeah, I could say a whole lot more about that, but for now we'll keep it there. I'll simply recognize that the fiscal condition of these two programs is at significant peril going forward with an aging population, as you might well imagine. You have more and more retirees drawing benefits, and proportionally speaking, a much lower percentage of people working to generate the revenues for those retirees. You know, at the beginning, right, in the 1930s, with Social Security's inception during the New Deal, we were a young country, lots of workers, relatively few retirees. That ratio has shifted steadily over the years, and we've reached a bit of a tipping point where now the revenues coming in are less than the benefits being paid out. And that's proving to be very difficult fiscally and politically. Medicare, same deal, only in some ways even more so, right? You qualify as an entitlement once you reach a certain age, and then you qualify for government provided benefits to a pretty significant degree. So with an aging population, again, same as with Social Security, fewer workers relative to retirees, less revenue relative to benefits being paid out, and with the provision of medical care, as you might imagine. Increases in the cost of medical care have been going up for decades now, much faster than the rate of inflation. We have fabulous new technologies, fabulous new medications that are extremely costly. And so between Social Security and Medicare, if we were to do nothing about our current revenue structure, our current benefit structure, the entire U.S. budget in the next, I think, 30, 40, 50 years, the entire budget would go to Social Security and Medicare. That's obviously not acceptable, right? We have lots of other needs, like the military, like aid for families with dependent children, federal highways, infrastructure, all sorts of other needs, as you might imagine. We cannot devote 100% of our budget to these two programs. So things need to be done, right, to change this calculus. Things have to be taken into account. Some would say we need more immigration because that brings young people who are more than happy to work. That might be part of the solution. It might mean lowering or raising the age of retirement before you qualify for full benefits. It might mean means testing for those receiving Medicare and Social Security benefits, more means testing than we currently have. It might mean higher rates of taxation. It might mean raising the cap on taxation for Social Security, because right now, an individual making about $115,000, you pay Social Security on that, but if you make anything beyond that number, you pay no more additional Social Security taxes. In some ways, that makes Social Security somewhat of a regressive tax in terms of percentage paid out. Because as your income goes beyond $115,000 or so, in a sense, your effective rate of taxation via Social Security actually goes down and down and down indefinitely. Some would say raise those caps, maybe the first $200,000, the first $500,000. So there are things that can be done and clearly must be done, but it's politically very difficult because who turns out at the highest rate in elections? Older people. Do they want the government messing around with, being stingier with Social Security and Medicare? For the most part, they do not. Right? It was under George W. Bush not so long ago that we dramatically expanded benefits being paid out under Medicare. Prescription drug benefits were greatly increased. It was a brilliant electoral strategy, arguably helped Bush win that election in 2004, but fiscally it was not a brilliant move. It actually moves us in exactly the wrong direction in some ways. It makes Medicare even more expensive and less sustainable fiscally going forward. So a lot of things we need to come to grips with on those two programs, driven by our shifting demographics. We should also take some note of the electoral dimension of our shifting age demographics. Right now, at least, young people tend to vote Democratic pretty significantly. Older people tend to vote pretty heavily Republican. That hasn't always been the case. Some people think young people tend to be Democrats, old people tend to be Republicans. Not true. Typically, when one comes of age, maybe 17, 18, 19, 20 years of age, at that point you usually identify with one party or the other, or perhaps neither. And that usually becomes your identity throughout your life cycle. So it's more of a cohort effect here and not an aging effect. So for a variety of reasons, I think partly because Obama was a young and charismatic candidate in 2000 and let me get this right, in 2008, I think he helped draw young people to the Democratic Party at a time when I think the Republicans were running candidates that were not attractive to younger voters. It was exactly the opposite when I was coming of age. Ronald Reagan was running for president in 1980. He drew a lot of young people to the GOP, and they've remained, for the most part, loyal to the Republican Party. So, right now, Democrats clearly have reason for optimism, right? If young people continue to identify as Democrats, which is open to question, the Democrats are sitting pretty there in terms of recruiting a constituency that's clearly growing. On the other hand, young people tend to vote in elections at a shockingly low rate. So the Democrats have lots of young devotees who often don't vote in elections. A little frustrating for the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, they're worried, right? They're not attracting young people in significant numbers right now, having trouble identifying with that constituency. They're trying to fix that. They're trying to figure out how they can better appeal to younger voters. But right now, at least, they have the allegiance of older voters, 65 and older. They tend to turn out at very high rates. We'll talk about that later in the semester. And for the most part, they vote Republican. So both parties have reasons for optimism, reasons for concern, right? Democrats optimistic about continuing to attract young people who are aging into the electorate, but having difficulty getting them to turn out in elections. Conversely, the Republican Party worried about their ability to attract younger voters. They need to figure that out at some point, of course. On the other hand, their most loyal devotees are older Americans who turn out in very large numbers in elections. But of course, their older voters eventually will age out, if you will, of the electorate. And so, again, for both parties, reasons for some optimism, reasons for some concern.